In 1812, one man controlled almost the entire continent of Europe. He had crowned himself emperor, conquered nations in months, rewritten borders with a single signature. Generals who'd spent their whole lives at war called him untouchable. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. 18 months later, he was a prisoner on a freezing island in the middle of the Atlantic, guarded day and night, with no army, no throne, and no way home. This is the story of how the most powerful man in Europe lost everything. Not in one battle, not in one mistake. In a slow, brutal collapse that started with a decision he was warned not to make. The peak, 045 sur Carc. By 1810, Napoleon's empire stretched across most of mainland Europe. France, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, large parts of Germany, all answered to him directly, or through rulers he'd installed himself. He had achieved something almost no one in European history ever had. Total dominance by force, by treaty, by sheer relentless momentum. But there was one country that refused to fully bend: Russia. Tsar Alexander I had once been an ally. The two men had even shaken hands on a raft in the middle of a river to sign a peace agreement. But that alliance was built on one condition. Russia had to stop all trade with Britain, Napoleon's last remaining enemy, as part of his economic blockade known as the Continental System. By the end of 1810, Alexander had quietly broken that promise. Napoleon saw it for what it was: defiance. And in Napoleon's mind, defiance had only one answer. The invasion begins, 3:30. In June 1812, Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen for a single campaign. Over 600,000 men. Troops from 20 different nations, all marching under his command. He crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory, expecting exactly what had worked for him a dozen times before. Push hard, force a decisive battle, win it, and march home as the victor. But the Russians refused to play that game. Instead of standing and fighting, the Russian army retreated. Again and again and again. Pulling Napoleon's massive army deeper and deeper into Russian territory, stretching his supply lines to breaking point. And behind them, they left nothing. Villages burned, crops destroyed, wells poisoned. A deliberate scorched earth strategy designed to starve the invaders rather than fight them directly. Napoleon's army was winning every skirmish and losing the war with every single step forward. Moscow, 3:30. By September, after a brutal and bloody battle at Borodino that left tens of thousands dead on both sides, Napoleon's exhausted army finally reached the one prize that was supposed to end it all: Moscow. He marched in expecting the Tsar to surrender, expecting the city to be his, fully, the way every other capital had fallen before it. Instead, he found it empty. The Russian governor had ordered the city burned before the French arrived. Fires spread for days, destroying most of Moscow, including its university, its markets, entire districts reduced to ash. Napoleon sat inside the Kremlin, in a city that was now a smoking ruin, waiting for a surrender that was never coming. Weeks passed, then a month. The Tsar said nothing, and outside the city walls, the Russian winter was beginning to arrive. The retreat, 5:7. By late October, Napoleon understood the truth. There would be no surrender, no victory to claim, just an army, deep inside hostile territory, with winter closing in and no way to resupply. He gave the order to retreat. What followed was one of the most catastrophic withdrawals in military history. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Soldiers froze where they stood. Horses collapsed and died by the thousands, leaving artillery and supply wagons stranded in the snow. Russian forces harassed the retreating army constantly, picking off stragglers, striking at the edges of a column that grew weaker and more desperate with every mile. By November, Napoleon's fighting force, an army that had crossed into Russia over 600,000 strong, had collapsed to a fraction of that number. At the Berezina River, the remnants of the Grande Armée faced near total destruction. Trapped against the water with Russian forces closing in from multiple directions. Only through a desperate, costly crossing did any of them escape at all. Of the more than 600,000 men who marched into Russia, roughly 380,000 never came home. It was not a defeat. It was an annihilation. The emperor abandons his army, 7 to 8 weeks, and then came the moment that would define how history remembers this campaign. As word reached Napoleon that a coup was forming back in Paris, built on rumors that he was dead or finished, he made a choice. He left. He handed command of what remained of his shattered army to one of his marshals, climbed into a sleigh, and rushed back to France to protect his throne. The same man who had marched alongside his soldiers through victory after victory was no longer there when they needed him most. News of the disaster spread fast, and the empire that had seemed unbreakable just months earlier suddenly looked, for the first time, beatable. The coalition closes in 1915. One by one, the allies who had only ever bent to Napoleon out of fear began to break away. Prussia turned on him and joined Russia. Parts of Germany rose up in open rebellion against French rule. Sweden joined the growing alliance against him. Austria, once a cautious ally, finally broke away too. A new coalition formed. Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, all moving against a single target. In October 1813, the two sides met at Leipzig in what would become known as the Battle of Nations. Over 500,000 soldiers clashing in one of the largest battles Europe had ever seen. Napoleon lost, decisively. By the following spring, Allied forces were closing in on Paris itself from every direction. Even as his capital fell, Napoleon refused to accept the peace terms being offered to him. It didn't matter anymore. In March 1814, Paris surrendered, and the man who had once redrawn the map of Europe was forced into exile on the small island of Elba. The final act, 9:15 to 10:15. Most stories about powerful men ending in disgrace would stop there. Napoleon's didn't. In 1815, after less than a year in exile, he escaped Elba, returned to France, and somehow managed to raise an army and retake power, if only briefly. One last desperate attempt to reclaim everything he'd lost. It ended at a small Belgian town called Waterloo. Defeated decisively, for the final time, Napoleon's allies made sure there would be no second escape. He was exiled again, this time to St. Helena, a remote island over 1,000 miles from the nearest land, chosen specifically because escape from it was considered impossible. He died there in 1821, the same man who once controlled an entire continent, now confined to a small house on a rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The lesson, 10:15 to 11 hours. What actually destroyed Napoleon wasn't one battle, one betrayal, or one mistake. It was the same pattern, repeating itself. Overreach. The belief that one more victory, one more campaign, one more push would finally secure everything for good. Russia wasn't beaten in a single battle. It collapsed slowly, through exhaustion, distance, and a winter that didn't care how powerful he believed himself to be. His empire didn't fall because his enemies became stronger. It fell because he refused to recognize the moment he should have stopped. If this story taught us anything, it's that even the most powerful position can become the most fragile, the moment ambition stops listening to warning signs. Outro. 1130. If you found this story as gripping as we did putting it together, subscribe for more deep dives into the rise and fall of history's most powerful figures.